Welcome to the Uranium Unleashed podcast. Welcome to the Uranium One podcast. We are jumping straight into our sources today because we're tracking a structural anomaly in the global commodity markets that, honestly, it defies basic logic.
It really does.
Right.
Yeah.
We are sitting here on March 25, 2026, staring at this massive, glaring paradox in the global uranium market. And the core thesis screaming from our stack of mining intelligence reports and market data is that, well, institutional investors are completely misreading the moment.
Oh, 100%. They're getting it completely wrong.
To set the table for you listening, Kazatomprom, which is the absolute heavyweight champion of global uranium production, has just quietly slashed its 2026 output guidance. And they did this at the exact same moment that NexGen Energy's massive Rook I project finally secured its federal construction approval.
Yeah, the timing is wild.
It's crazy. We are talking about the sudden reduction of the world's largest current supply source, colliding directly with the approval of the world's largest future supply source.
And the fallout from that collision is really what makes this deep dive so critical. You have a very real, very immediate cut in physical supply on one hand,
Right.
and then a regulatory approval for new future supply on the other. So the broader market is looking at those two events. They're looking at a recent, rather sharp drop in the uranium spot price, and they're basically concluding that the nuclear fuel cycle is finally balancing out.
Yeah, because the spot price opened this year incredibly strong. I mean, over $100 a pound, touching $101.50 in January. And then it suddenly pulled back to the $85 to $92 range by mid-March.
Right, a noticeable drop.
Exactly. I'm looking at reports showing utilities and financial players treating this drop as a return to normal. They see the NexGen approval, they see the spot price dip, and they think the fever has broken.
Which is a profound and honestly incredibly dangerous misreading of the situation.
Yeah.
For anyone relying on this commodity or investing in the energy space, we need to be crystal clear. This is not normalization.
No, not at all.
It is a fundamental misunderstanding of a structural 50 million pound global supply deficit. The market is mistaking a temporary, noisy price fluctuation for a permanent structural resolution. And they are doing it at the worst possible time in the contracting cycle.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because before we can evaluate the new mine that just got approved, we have to understand the sheer scale of the deficit we're currently standing in. We need to look at the Kazatomprom shock and the brutal mathematics of global uranium supply.
Yeah, the math here is entirely unforgiving. To ground this for you, Kazatomprom is the state-owned producer in Kazakhstan, and they control roughly 45% of global uranium mine output.
Which is massive.
It's huge. They are the swing producer. They are the price setter. Historically, if the world needed more uranium, Kazakhstan simply turned the taps up.
But the taps are visibly drying up now. Our sources show they have revised their 2026 production guidance down to just 62 million pounds of U3O8. That is a massive downgrade from their originally projected target of 85 million pounds.
It is a 23 million pound reduction from a single producer. That's a 27% drop from their target.
Wow.
And perhaps most alarmingly, it's a cut that takes them below even their already reduced 2025 output levels. That is a staggering amount of physical material to just, vanish from the global ledger.
A 23 million pound shortfall is nearly equal to half of all current U.S. reactor requirements.
Yeah.
Just gone.
Exactly.
And the intelligence reports emphasize that this isn't some random fluke or a one-time operational stumble. This is their third consecutive annual cut. I want to dig into the mechanism here because the sources point to severe sulfuric acid shortages and major infrastructure constraints. Why is sulfuric acid the bottleneck for a uranium miner?
Well, it's because of the specific way Kazakhstan mines its uranium. They don't dig massive open pits. They use a method called in-situ recovery, or ISR.
Okay, ISR.
Yeah. Essentially, they drill a well field and pump a chemical solution down into the ore body. And that solution is heavily reliant on sulfuric acid. The acid literally dissolves the uranium out of the sandstone underground, and then they pump that uranium-rich solution back to the surface.
So it's chemical mining, which means if you don't have the acid, you physically cannot dissolve the uranium. It just stays locked in the rock?
Precisely. You cannot just turn a dial and make more uranium appear when the physical chemistry and the regional supply chain of sulfuric acid aren't cooperating.
Right.
They are running into the very real physical limits of trying to endlessly scale up in-situ recovery operations.
And the global context makes that bottleneck terrifying.
Mm-hmm.
Right now, global reactor demand, so the amount of U3O8 needed to keep the lights on and power grids functioning, is about 180 million pounds annually.
Yeah.
but global primary mine production is only sitting at roughly 130 million pounds. I like to think about it like a household budget.
That's a good way to frame it.
Right. Imagine you only earn $130,000 a year, but you are forced to spend $180,000 a year. You are bleeding $50,000 annually.
Leaving us with a 50 million pound gap every single year.
Yes. So if Kazatomprom is the world's swing producer and they are suddenly short 23 million pounds, who else can possibly cover that gap? Where is that 50 million pounds actually coming from today?
What's fascinating here is how the market has historically patched that hole and why that patch is rapidly failing. That 50 million pound gap is currently being plugged by what the industry calls secondary supplies.
Secondary supplies. I want to make sure you define that clearly because it sounds like an accounting trick, but it's actual physical material, right?
It is physical material, but it is finite. We are talking about above-ground inventories held by utilities and governments that have been aggressively drawn down over the last decade. We are also talking about a process called underfeeding, which involves re-enriching depleted uranium tails. Essentially, taking the leftover waste material from previous enrichment cycles and using excess enrichment capacity to squeeze the absolute last atoms of utility out of it.
Got it. It's kind of the equivalent of a homeowner burning their antique furniture to keep the house warm because the firewood delivery truck broke down.
That is the perfect way to look at it.
It absolutely works to keep you from freezing tonight, but eventually you run out of chairs.
Yeah, eventually you're out of chairs. And the crucial caveat to that furniture is that extracting it relies heavily on Russian conversion and enrichment capacity.
Of course.
And Western utilities are under immense geopolitical pressure to sever their dependence on Russian nuclear services. So those secondary cushions are highly finite and heavily constrained by global politics.
You can't rely on them forever.
No, you cannot rely on secondary supplies forever. Eventually, the well runs dry. Every pound consumed from secondary supply without a corresponding investment in primary mine production just narrows the window before reality sets in.
Which brings us to the event the market believes will save us from the cold. Because the world is desperately bleeding secondary supply, the market is desperately looking for a savior.
And they think they found one?
Right. According to the news from early March, that savior just arrived. Here's where it gets really interesting. On March 6, 2026, NexGen Energy received its Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, the CNSC federal construction license for the Rook I project.
Out in the Athabasca Basin in Saskatchewan.
Yes, and the scale of this project outlined in the research is just staggering.
It really represents a generational shift in the Western uranium supply base. It is the largest undeveloped uranium resource in the Western world.
The sources show Rook I has the capacity to produce up to 30 million pounds of uranium per year.
Which is incredible.
Let's put that in context. That is more than 20% of current global supply and over 50% of Western world supply.
Yeah.
It brings $37 billion in economic output over its life of mine and 1,400 annual jobs to the region. It is a true behemoth.
The federal approval is incredibly significant. It clears the major regulatory hurdle for a project that fundamentally alters the global supply map. But there is a catch that the market seems to be completely discounting.
The actual physical calendar.
Yes, the timeline.
Construction on Rook I begins in the summer of 2026. The build, assuming everything goes perfectly, is expected to take 4 years, which means not a single pound of uranium from this massive savior of a mine will reach the market before approximately 2030.
And building a mine in the Athabasca Basin is an incredibly complex engineering feat. You are dealing with freezing groundwater to sink shafts and building massive physical infrastructure in a really remote location.
Right.
The regulatory clock is stopped, but the construction clock is just starting.
So I have to push back on the market's reaction here. Wait, if Rook I is going to produce more than 50% of Western supply, why isn't the market celebrating this as an absolute win right now? Or rather, if it's such a massive win, why isn't it solving the panic today? Is the market just blind to the calendar?
The market is confusing an announcement with a delivery. Rook I is the long-term solution to a near-term problem. The deficit of 50 million pounds exists now.
Now, like today.
Exactly. 2026, 2027, 2028, 2029. Those are years where the primary mine supply is completely insufficient, secondary supplies are dwindling, and the historical swing producer, Kazakhstan, is visibly struggling to maintain its baseline, let alone absorb new demand.
And utilities can't just power down a nuclear reactor and tell their grid operators they're waiting for 2030. A reactor needs a constant, secure baseline of fuel.
which means utilities and end users of nuclear fuel are caught in a very dangerous waiting game. Every single year that utilities delay their long-term contracting while holding their breath for Rook I to come online, they drastically increase their exposure to structurally higher prices.
They're taking a massive risk.
They are playing chicken with a supply cliff, basically assuming the secondary supplies will hold out just long enough for NexGen to start shipping yellow cake.
Which leads us directly into the market delusion we touched on earlier. We just established that the massive new mine doesn't produce until 2030, and the current biggest producer on Earth is slashing output by 27%.
Yeah.
So why on earth is the spot price of uranium going down right now?
It's the core paradox of our deep dive. The spot price opened 2026 strong, peaking at $101.50 in January, and then we saw a pullback to the $85 to $92 range by mid-March.
Right, and if I'm an institutional investor looking at my terminal and I see a price drop to $85, my instinct is that the supply chain is healing. I see the Rook I headline, I see the price drop, and I assume the tension is leaving the market. Is this price drop just a financial mirage?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to separate the spot market from the long-term contract market. The uranium spot market is relatively thinly traded. It does not represent where massive utilities are securing their 10-year baseload fuel supplies. The pullback we saw was driven by short-term inventory liquidation from financial players.
So likely taking profits after the massive run-up over the last few years.
Exactly. Combined with reduced near-term spot purchasing by utilities who are momentarily pausing to assess the landscape.
So it's financial noise.
Yeah.
It's paper trading and short-term profit-taking, not actual physical pounds entering the system to fix the 50 million pound deficit.
Exactly that. The fundamentals haven't healed. In fact, with the Kazatomprom Cut, they've objectively worsened.
Wow.
Our sources highlight a report from Trade Tech recently showing the largest single-week percentage gain in uranium spot prices since March 2022. That metric alone shows immense underlying volatility. The tension is still there, coiled tightly beneath the surface.
Utilities who haven't locked in long-term supply contracts before 2027 are facing a dangerously different pricing environment.
Oh, absolutely.
The consensus response from the market regarding both the Kazatomprom Cut and the Rook I approval has been muted to the point of negligence.
Yeah, it's negligent.
When you treat a temporary, liquidity-driven price pullback as a signal of normalization, you are confusing a short-term reprieve with a structural resolution.
The structural deficit is real, it is widening, and the nuclear fuel cycle has notoriously long lead times. From mining the ore to conversion to enrichment to fuel fabrication, it takes years for a pound of uranium to actually end up in a reactor core.
Right.
The market will feel the severe pain of this deficit long before Rook I is able to solve it.
Let's look at who is going to be caught most off guard when this physical shortage really bites. This is where we get into the geopolitical time bomb and exploding future demand.
This part is fascinating.
We've established the market is misreading the timeline, but the context around who needs this uranium and how much they need makes it so much worse.
The United States context is particularly alarming when you look at their domestic capabilities versus their geopolitical positioning. The U.S. Energy Information Administration, the EIA, reported that domestic uranium concentrate production fell 44% in the third quarter of 2025.
44%. And we weren't producing much to begin with.
No, we really weren't.
The sources note there are only 6 operating facilities nationwide. As a result, the United States currently imports approximately 95% of its uranium requirements. They're almost entirely dependent on foreign supply chains.
And yet, at the exact same time domestic production is plummeting, the demand signals coming from the policy level are going vertical.
Right.
The U.S. government has announced commitments of up to $80 billion to fund new domestic reactor construction. On top of that, there are U.S. Cameco partnerships and $2.7 billion in contracts specifically designed to offset Russian supply shortfalls.
So what does this all mean? The U.S. is pledging $80 billion to build a massive new fleet of nuclear reactors, while domestic mining just dropped 44%, and we import 95% of our fuel.
It's a huge disconnect.
Aren't we basically building a fleet of massive luxury cars without having any idea which gas station is actually open?
Yes.
The cars look great in the driveway, but they can't drive without the fuel.
This raises an important question about how policy urgency translates into physical reality. The desire to build reactors, secure clean baseload energy, and power the next generation of industry is operating on one timeline.
Right.
Market supply, the actual physics of digging rocks out of the ground, navigating permitting, and processing the ore is operating on an entirely different timeline.
And we're seeing this demand explosion globally too, right? It's not just a U.S. phenomenon.
Not at all. The World Nuclear Association, the WNA, in their 2025 fuel report, projects that global uranium requirements will more than double. They are forecasting a jump from roughly 69,000 metric tons of uranium in 2025 to over 150,000 metric tons by 2040.
Let's translate that back to the pounds we were talking about earlier. Currently, global mine production is roughly 130 million pounds, which is equivalent to about 50,000 metric tons.
Right.
So we are already starting from a deficit today, and the baseline requirement is shooting up to 150,000 metric tons.
And that's just the baseline. The sources outline a high-growth scenario that fundamentally breaks the current supply models.
How so?
Well, powered by the massive electricity demands of AI-driven data centers, plus the nuclear renaissance we are seeing across Europe, Japan, and emerging markets. In that high-growth scenario, requirements could exceed 204,000 metric tons.
The disconnect is profound. You have government funding for future reactors, which is crucial for long-term energy security, but it adds massive layers of long-term demand without solving the near-term supply equation.
Exactly.
Putting $80 billion on the table for new reactors only exacerbates the future demand crunch if you don't have the fuel cycle secured first.
The deficit exists right now. The uranium needed to run the reactors of 2028 needs to be contracted and entering the fuel cycle today. And the only project on the horizon capable of moving the needle, Rook I, won't yield its first pound until the end of the decade.
To synthesize all of this for you listening, we are looking at a market steeped in cognitive dissonance. On one side, Kazatomprom, the world's largest producer and historical swing supplier, is shrinking its output to its lowest level in years, down 27% from its target due to very real chemical and infrastructure constraints. On the other side, domestic U.S. supply is near historic lows, while future demand for AI data centers and new government-funded reactors is exploding.
And in the middle of all of this, the spot price is lying to us. It has pulled back from $101.50 to the $85 to $92 range, giving institutional investors a completely false sense of security.
They're looking at the wrong signals.
They are looking at thin financial liquidity movements and confusing that noise with a structural fix to a massive physical deficit.
Because everyone is pointing at NexGen Energy's Rook I approval as the ultimate savior, a 30 million pound per year behemoth that will secure Western supply and finally balance the books.
But the reality, the physical calendar, is undefeated. If there is one ultimate thesis to take away from all these intelligence reports, it is this.
Okay.
Rook I is the answer to the uranium crisis. The problem is, the crisis is happening now, and Rook I doesn't produce until 2030.
We are looking at a 4-year window of extreme vulnerability.
We really are.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We've covered the brutal math of the Kazatomprom cuts, the timeline reality of NexGen's approval, the delusion of the spot price, and the geopolitical time bomb of future demand.
It's a lot to process.
It is, but I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over as you watch this market unfold over the coming months. If everyone is banking on Rook I fixing the market in 2030, what happens to the energy utility companies who try to play it safe and wait until 2028 or 2029 to try and secure their fuel?
That's the million-dollar question.
When they finally realize the secondary supplies have burned out and they knock on the door to sign a contract, they might just find that the line for that physical uranium already stretches around the block and the price of admission has fundamentally changed. Keep an eye on the long-term contract market, not just the spot price.